Well, thank you to everybody who is joining us for our discussion this afternoon. Um, Philip Howard and I will be speaking about public labor unions, what they are, how they've evolved, and importantly, some of the accountability issues that are raised with government labor unions as they relate to a Republican form of government. Just as a brief background, I'll introduce myself. I'll introduce Mr. Howard, and then we'll get right into it. As a couple housekeeping matters, feel free to type any questions in the question and answer box. We'll be monitoring those, and as questions come in, we'll take them and answer them so we can make this as much of a discussion as possible. So my name is Jon Riches. I'm the Director of National Litigation at the Goldwater Institute. The Institute was established in 1988 under the namesake of Senator Barry Goldwater. And from 1988 until 2007, we operated as a traditional state-based think tank. So we would do things like original policy research and analysis. We would prepare model legislation and advocate for its passage, mostly in the state of Arizona. In 2007, Clint Bolick came on board. Mr. Bolick is now a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court, and he stood up our litigation center. And when he did that, we became the first state-based organization in the country to have under one roof a public policy and legislation component and a public interest litigation component, such that we could address areas of Goldwater's limited government mission from essentially all areas of public policy, research analysis, legislatively, and also through the courts when constitutional rights are implicated. The topic today, public labor unions and public labor reform, is one of those issues where so much of public policy and the law overlap. And I know that is Philip's, oftentimes his area of expertise. So we're very, very lucky to be joined by Philip Howard. Philip is a leading expert on government and legal reform. He's the author of multiple books, including The Death of Common Sense. His most recent book is Try Common Sense, Replacing Failed Ideologies of the Left and Right. He has produced a very popular TED Talk. He's advised senior government officials. In 2002, he formed Common Good, which is a nonpartisan national coalition dedicated to restoring common sense solutions to America and our system of governance. Philip is currently senior counsel at Covington and Burling. He attended Yale and law school at UVA. So before we turn it over to Philip, and thanks again, Philip, for joining us, I thought it would be helpful for a lot of our viewers if I sort of briefly outlined what are we talking about when we talk about government labor unions? What are they? How do they differ from private sector labor unions? What are the consequences of government unionization? And then what accountability problems do they create? So I'd ask our viewers, if you'd imagine for a moment what a typical union boss in your mind might look like, what would you imagine? And I suspect you would develop a picture of a blue-collar male who, sort of a tough, gruff sort of character. And I think that image of a union boss would be accurate up until probably the 1950s and 60s. Today, though, if you really want to know what a union boss looks like, they're going to look a lot more like a librarian or a teacher or perhaps a firefighter or a police officer. The reason that's the case is because unionization membership in the United States has changed dramatically over the last several decades. So in 1955, organized labor accounted for 1/3 of the non-agricultural workforce. Today, it's less than 6.3%. So it went from 1/3 to less than 6.3%. That's for private sector labor unions. The trend for public sector labor unions, government unions, is exactly the opposite. In 1950, about 10% of the public workforce was unionized. Today, it's about 35%. So it's literally gone exactly the opposite direction. Today, there's more than 5 times the rate of unionization among government workers than there is private sector workers. So this picture of what a typical union boss, even a union member, looks like is very different than it historically was. It used to primarily be blue-collar men Now it's mostly educated white collar individual with rough gender parity. The change was the result of an expansion of government power, a decline of manufacturing, among many, many other things. And of course, as with most other things, the private sector abandoned private sector labor unions long before the public sector has or will. Interestingly, public sector labor unions were not always a foregone conclusion by any rate. There were some very early objectors and some very early, maybe for some of our viewers, some very early surprising objectors. So for example, FDR was an early opponent of government labor unions. He said that, quote, all government employees should realize the process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service. He thought it thinkable and intolerable, that's a quote, that those sworn to support the operations of government would ever take actions that could potentially lead to government's paralysis. So he simply viewed government labor unions as incompatible with Republican government. I'll give you another quick quote here. It is impossible to bargain collectively with the government. Any of our viewers want to contemplate for a minute who might have said something like that? It is impossible to bargain collectively with the government. Well, I think you kind of think about it, like maybe that was a Ronald Reagan, a Newt Gingrich, maybe a Scott Walker. That was George Meany. He was the first president of the AFL-CIO. So I say all this because there was some very early valid criticism of government labor unions from quarters where you might not expect it today, that highlights a lot of the problems that were frankly seen with public sector labor unions. So what is it about what is it about government unions that are different from private labor unions, and what special problems do they pose? So the first thing to understand, I think, is that public sector labor unions put in place collective bargaining agreements. So this is where a government labor group will go to a government employer, a city, a state, a town, an agency, and they'll negotiate a collective bargaining agreement, which has the force and operation of law. It's essentially an employment contract. And that covers everything from wages and benefits to a whole host of other items that oftentimes have very little to do with whatever service those employees are providing. Now, interestingly, whatever labor unit a government union represents, they all might not be union members and oftentimes aren't. So you could have a government labor union that maybe only 50% of the unit it represents are in fact dues paying members, but it negotiates a collective bargaining agreement for all of the employees that fall under it. So you have a situation where a labor union, a politically active labor union, is making very consequential decisions on government resources and the allocation of government resources, on public policy questions, purporting to represent an entire body of government employees, when oftentimes only a minority of those employees choose to belong to the union and pay dues to it, which raises, in my mind, some very significant free associational, free expression questions, which the US Supreme Court has grappled with in recent years. And I'm sure Philip will talk a little bit more about that. But I view three primary issues to think about in terms of the problems posed by government labor unions. The first, in my view, is that public service is a public trust, and government employees have a fiduciary obligation to the public and to the tax-paying public. And of course, a fiduciary obligation means you put others' rights and responsibilities before your own. Now, of course, when you're talking about labor unions, and particularly labor bosses, leaders of labor unions, they also have fiduciary duties to the labor union. And so you have this sort of tension where on the one hand, you have government employees who owe a fiduciary duty to the public, and then you have government labor union leaders who owe a fiduciary obligation to their union. And many times, in my view, that's just simply incompatible. Now, look, it is right and proper for private sector folks to organize. They have a constitutional right to. But when you have this competing fiduciary duties, it creates several problems. And I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about those with Philip in more detail. A second issue is collective bargaining takes some of the most important decision-making about government functions, government accountability, and it transfers it from elected officials to union leaders that aren't elected by anybody in the public. So rather than having public officials, make important public decisions, oftentimes they cede control to government labor unions. And if you think about it, how much influence does our largest national teachers unions have over public education in America versus elected leaders? I would say it's an enormous, outsized influence in many cases. The third problem is that you have a monopoly system where only one group often is providing services, and there's no market pressure to essentially keep a union's demands in check. So for example, only the police are providing police services. Only the fire department is providing fire services. Public school teachers are providing services in public education, and there's no real market pressures on that. There's a little more so in education than public safety, but there's no real market pressures in that. And it makes things like pay or benefits hard to value. So when a company sits down at the bargaining table with a labor union, it's the company playing with the company's money, negotiating with the company's money, the company's continuing viability. And they're able to kind of compare labor demands and labor costs in the market in a way that doesn't translate into the public service. And then finally, and probably most perniciously, in my view, government labor unions, in the words of a former AFSCME political boss in New York, have the ability to elect their own boss. There is a notoriously symbiotic relationship between politicians and the public unions that elect them. Oftentimes, and we'll talk a little bit about this, unions engage in tremendous political activities where they're giving enormous amounts of sums to political leaders. They also have access to politicians that no other special interest has. When a union sits down at the collective bargaining table with a government entity, it's the union and the government. Nobody else has that sort of access to enter into an agreement that has tremendous public policy implications that have the force of law than a labor union does. In terms of the political spending, by the way, $92 million was spent just by some of the leading public sector unions in the last federal election alone. The National Litigation Association spent $44 million in the last election cycle. 96% of that went to members of the Democratic Party. The American Federation of Teachers spent $15 million in the last election. 99.2% of that went to members of the Democratic Party. I would be surprised if all of the members of that particular union were 99.2% voted Democrat, but that's the way the spending goes. So what are the consequences of all of this? One, when you talk about collective bargaining, it's not really a negotiation. It's not a real negotiation if the labor union is essentially holding a gun to the head of the political leaders that they elect and support politically. That's not a real arm's length transaction. Second, if you like bigger government, more expansive government, labor unions are largely as a result. And it's not just pay and benefits, which of course are immune from market forces that we talked about, but labor unions have an enormous influence on public policy that might not have anything to do with any of those things. I'll give you a quick example. In California, prior to 1980, there were 12 state prisons in the entire state, 12. Then the California Correctional Peace Officers Association was formed. From 1980 to 2000, 22 new prisons were constructed, often at the behest of the Peace Officers Union. And of course, not only did they advocate for new prisons to create new jobs, but they advocated for things like 3 strike laws so that there would be more opportunities to put people in those prisons in those sorts of areas. So frankly, this all creates a whole lot of problems. It creates an accountability problem. Labor unions aren't accountable. They're unelected. They dual fiduciary duties. They're monopoly providers. They're not accountable to policymakers because they help elect them. We saw a really dangerous accountability problem with the Derek Chauvin and George Floyd issue. Derek Chauvin, the police officer who was convicted of the murder of George Floyd, had 17 complaints over an 18-year period prior to being charged with George Floyd's murder. Now, unfortunately, the disciplinary processes that were put in place in the collective bargaining agreements, and this is true throughout the country, make it nearly impossible to discipline or fire employees, including employees like Derek Chauvin. The Minnesota police chief called the employment provisions, quote, debilitating. Interestingly, oftentimes, union officials who negotiate these provisions do it on something that's called release time, where taxpayers are literally footing the bill for the union members to negotiate these provisions, where they're being released from their government jobs to work solely for the union. They do things like negotiate collective bargaining agreement, and then they do things like represent public employees in disciplinary proceedings while they're being paid by taxpayers. So in this situation, taxpayers are literally footing the bill to keep bad apples in government employment. So this raises all sorts of due process, accountability problems. I want to turn it over to Philip at this point to get his reaction and maybe to discuss some of these other accountability issues in more detail. I think you might be on mute, Philip.
Thank you, John. Thanks everybody for coming. I think this is a more important issue than most people give it credit for. It's just not a matter of efficiency. It's a matter of the functioning of our democracy. John mentioned the difference between public and private unions. Another difference is that private unions have an incentive to keep the business going and solvent, because they'll lose their job otherwise. So there's a natural, the market forces not only work for corporate management, but they also work for union leadership. Because if they drive the car company bankrupt, then there are not going to be any jobs for the employees. There is no such counterweight with public unions. And what's happened over the last 5 decades is that the public unions have literally rendered a number of states effectively bankrupt by demanding benefits that there is no reasonable basis to believe the taxpayers could ever afford. And as a matter of history, public unions existed before the 1960s, but they did not have the power of collective bargaining. And so there were even unions when FDR was talking about it. LaGuardia was another opponent of collective bargaining, a very liberal mayor in New York City. But there was no such thing as collective bargaining in the public sector. It happened when JFK simply gave it as a payoff to the public unions who supported him in his 1960 campaign, and he signed an executive order. And then the union leaders during the rights revolution, really nobody even noticed this happen, demanded that they get public collective bargaining rights as well. And so first New York, then California, then other states, and everybody just fell over, because who can be against somebody having rights, due process rights and such. And what's happened in the last 50 years is that many of the things of the 1960s have proven to be catastrophic in the running of government. And it's not about conservative versus liberal. It's about the growth of bureaucracy and micromanagement. And there was no such thing as 1,000-page rule books before the 1960s. The Interstate Highway Act was 29 pages long. 10 years later, 21,000 miles of road had been built. The last transportation bill was 600 pages long, was implemented by about 15,000 pages of regulations, and it takes 10 years just to get a permit. This is all a function of the unintended consequences of trying to create a system of government after the 1960s where everything was sort of perfect, where if anybody didn't like something, they could bring a claim. If an employee felt unhappy, he could demand arbitration in the government. And so, you know, we're coming up to this reckoning in our society of the fact that the government doesn't work. It can't deliver. It can't build infrastructure. You can't build
Philip,
a new. Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. Would you, we got just a couple comments in the chat line. Would
Right.
you mind speaking up just a little bit? Some folks are having trouble hearing.
Sure. How's this? This
That,
better?
that's much better.
Yeah. Okay. Right. It's my thing floating around. So we're at a point in our society where we have to look at the operating systems of government. We have to actually look at how things work and why schools don't work, why we can't rebuild infrastructure, why it takes 10 years to give a permit, that sort of thing. And unions are at the heart of this. And while unions represent, what was it, 35%, John, of all public employees?
Yep.
We're talking about a country in which something like 22 million people work for the government. It's by far the largest voting bloc in the country. So this, th- these unions have a power that's politically virtually impregnable. Even Republicans, Scott Walker took them on, but it's very rare to really take them head on because they're so powerful. The Democrats won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So to jump to the bottom line, my group, commongood.org, is now beginning to organize some citizen leaders around the country around bringing a constitutional challenge to the public unions. And our idea, which I'm going to go into, is not just that they're inefficient or they cost more or they make it sometimes hard to get things done. The big idea is that they've actually preempted democracy. You can elect someone, but that someone actually doesn't have the authority to run the schools. The police chief they appoint in Minneapolis didn't even have the authority to reassign Derek Chauvin, who everybody thought was a really weird person. So here are some of the, it's a quick list of the evils here. Government is virtually unmanageable. As a result of the collective bargaining agreements, public employees go to work viewing their job not as delivering results, but as complying with rules. We've created this rule-based government where it's, you talk to someone and you say, yes, but this doesn't make any sense. Use your common sense. They say, I'm sorry, the rule made me do it. That's all a result of this kind of mechanistic approach that starts and is mandated by the collective bargaining agreements. Second evil, there's zero accountability. An average of 2 teachers in California out of about 300,000 get dismissed for performance every year, 2 out of 300,000. California is one of the worst school systems in the country. More federal employees die on the job than are held accountable for public employment. It's literally impossible to, they say, oh, it's just a matter of due process. It's not a matter of due process. Due process actually flips the presumption. It puts the burden on supervisors to prove that the employee is so much worse than everyone else. And the due process doesn't just apply with one decision. It applies at each of like 20 steps in the process. If you want to put something negative in the file about a public employee, the public employee can grieve it. And the supervisor has to go justify himself to an arbitrator, often in a hearing, just for that one thing, putting something in the file. So as one school superintendent put it, firing a teacher is not a decision, it's a career. No one can do it. So it's interesting. I've written about the history of civil service, and the whole point of civil service was to get rid of the spoils system where public jobs were considered a kind of property. So someone would get elected and they would give the public jobs to their supporters. And so it was a neutral hiring mechanism. It was not a mechanism of tenure. It was hiring people based on ability off of their resumes and testing and all that kind of stuff. What's happened now is that public jobs have become a property right again. The evil of the spoils system but at least the spoils system was accountable politically. Now it's accountable to no one. You elect a governor and he says this person's not doing the job, and the governor has no authority to do anything. And another bad thing about zero accountability is when you can't hold somebody accountability for how they do their job, what you get is like an exponential growth in bureaucracy that makes people just follow rules. So you get this kind of kudzu of bureaucracy that's grown up and said, because everything depends on a rule, every decision. Nobody can use their common sense. So that's accountability. The third evil is that they've driven states bankrupt. These promises are made by elected officials to give rich pensions that kick in long after the elected official has left office. The elected official suffers no consequences, no accountability, because these pensions come out and the pensions, the abuses are just rampant. Like you can triple your pension in many states by spiking overtime in the last year of employment, that sort of thing. In the state of Illinois, which is one of the bankrupt states, there are over 20,000 former public employees with pensions between $1 and $300,000 a year. So you're talking about basically $4 billion out of the general budget of the state of Illinois going to relatively a handful of public employees. It's an outrage. The benefits also often bear no relationship to commercially reasonable benefits. The pension plans, the health plans, there's no contribution required. So my view is that public employees are important. They ought to be honored. They ought to be paid well, but they ought to be paid well by the standards of the market, not be paid well because they're getting freebies for the election in order to support somebody's election. So you have these bankrupt states. And Jon mentioned this. The next evil, this is number 5 on my list, is that their power over the elected officials they are the largest interest group in the country. They are probably the most generous supporter, as Jon mentioned, $40 million by the teachers union in the last election cycle in the group. They're supposed to be representing the public interest, not controlling the public. They're supposed to work for the public, not the public working for them. And it's sort of gotten backwards. And then Jon also mentioned they're exercising that power over public policy. So who are the biggest opponents of charter schools and school choice and parochial schools and schools that actually work? Who are the biggest opponents? There's one. It's the teachers union. The people who are paying $40 million in the last election cycle to the political leaders. If there's a disagreement, the way these collective bargaining agreements work, it goes to an arbitrator who decides what the salaries will be, or who decides what the work conditions would be. But hold on a second. We're supposed to elect people. The democracy is a process by which you elect somebody good, like Doug Ducey, to run the state. And then if they don't do a good job, you elect somebody else who promises to do a better job. Nobody elected the arbitrators. There's arbitrators are deciding fundamental management and financial decisions for the public sector with zero accountability. And the last one is that a system in which no one is accountable is an incredibly dispiriting place to work. The Volcker Commission, there are 2 Volcker Commissions that studies on this. Working for the government can be horrible. It's horrible because who wants to work at a place where you think the guy next door is not doing his job? And the esprit de corps that you have in the best agencies comes from their sense of purpose and mission and all that sort of thing. Well, that should be the public sector broadly. It should be police forces and schools and all the schools, which requires people to use their personality and have a sense of obligation to each other and to know if somebody doesn't do their job, they won't have the job very often. very long. Instead, everybody knows if you don't do your job, you still keep it forever. And there are lots of studies and teachers who've said how dispiriting it is to work in an environment like this. So how do you fix this? And the answer is you can't. And most political leaders are just dealing with the art of the possible. And they say, gosh, this is impossible. They're too powerful. So they just throw up their hands and don't do anything, or make, marginal changes here or there. And so what I've argued in several recent law review articles and others is that there's a fundamental constitutional problem with collective bargaining, where you're bargaining against, John says, the public interest. And in the federal government, there's actually a lot of precedent for why I'm right. The Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive power should be vested in the president, and there's lots of Supreme Court precedent that says the president has illimitable power over executive branch employees, illimitable. And that's fundamentally inconsistent with the idea of collective bargaining. So that challenge, and I've engaged actually the leading public employee departments, of associations like the senior executive associations are supporting this because they can't manage their own employees. So the federal government's easy. The state and local governments are the problem because they really have, in many states, basically taken control of the politics of the state. States like California, Illinois, New York, Connecticut's another one. There's a provision in the U.S. Constitution in Article 4 called the Guarantee Clause. And the Guarantee Clause says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. What that means, according to historians, is that no state could establish an aristocracy. Ultimately, the people who run the government have to be accountable to voters. There has to be a direct link between people at the ballot box, the people who run the state, who are making the decisions about how to run the state. The clause has never really been interpreted. It was often debated and discussed during the 19th century because the abolitionists thought it should be used to ban slavery, that you couldn't that the slaves didn't have a vote, for example, to breach the Republican form of government. Nothing ever happened with that. But it was a much debated provision. But when you think about it, when you elect a governor in California or New York, or Minnesota, or a mayor, and they can't actually run the schools, and they can't run the police department, and they can't actually fix the budget because it's all been contractually. There's a stranglehold of the union collective bargaining agreements, on these governments. It's worse than any aristocracy. And so we're talking about creating a constitutional challenge, building, I think, a powerful brief with all the evils I mentioned, and bringing a constitutional challenge and getting it up to the Supreme Court to break the unions. And it will unlock the key. It will unlock the door, I think, to all kinds of reforms in government, not to get rid of government, but to make it work better, and to attract good people to work for government, and all the things that we ought to have in a government in a modern world, where we can't look after the purity of the water by ourselves. We can't check whether the toys have lead paint on them by ourselves. We need government to be effective. But instead, we've created a government where the schools all fail, or most of them fail, and police departments are unaccountable. It's just unacceptable. So I think it's time for a revolution, and I think the start to the revolution is a constitutional claim.
Thanks, Philip. That was great stuff. I have several questions and comments. If anyone else has questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll take them as they come in. Actually, there is one here now. Why don't we start with this, and then I got a couple as well, so I might take moderator privilege. But please keep the questions coming. So, Philip, this Alan is asking, arbitrators might not be so bad if their task was to decide based on equivalent work in the private sector. How could that not be happening now? I believe he means in the public sector.
Yeah. Okay. The way it's a good question, and I think having sort of what I'll call nonpartisan review mechanisms, there's a role for that in managing the public sector. So I do think there's a role for third parties. But the way the arbitrations work now is that they're incredibly pro-union. So for example, a teacher in New York City was convicted of selling cocaine to being a cocaine dealer, including to other teachers, was sent to jail, and came back and demanded his job back, and it went to arbitration, and the arbitrator said that under the contract he had to be given his job back as a teacher. This is a cocaine dealer. So you have a kind of an ethic right now of arbitrators who basically don't look at what's in the public interest. They look at any conceivable justification. The VA hospital in Arizona that was caught doing all these terrible things, the head of it was fired or sanctioned, and his defense, which he won on before an arbitrator, was that there was the powers that be couldn't find any specific place where he hadn't engaged in oversight. But the whole point of the claim was that he was in charge and the people below him had done all these terrible things. And so oversight by definition is catching the bad things. And he is arguing in defense that, oh no, you have to find a specific day where I didn't do something, instead of just the fact that he didn't do anything and he was in charge. So he won. This guy won. I mean, it was like crazy. So you have this kind of sophistry that goes on in arbitrations. I do think that there's a role for a nonpartisan, like a civil service commission, a merit protection board or something, not to try cases, but to look at complaints and just to make sure, just to protect against abuses. But basically, nobody has a right to a job. I mean, everybody on this, I don't know about anybody else. I've lost jobs before. I'm too arrogant or something. People didn't want to work with me. So you lose a job. It's not like having somebody take your home away. You go get another job. If you're so good, or if the person who's complaining is so good, you get another job. I mean, we have all these protections as if having a public job is like fine china or something. I mean, it's just not. It's like any other job.
So I was doing a panel where there was a lawmaker who was quite a large union sympathizer on the panel with me, and I was talking about some of these accountability problems. And he goes, well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, we're responsible as the lawmakers, and we can keep the unions in check. So why was he wrong? I mean, why isn't it true that the public can hold the lawmakers responsible for some of these things?
Well, the public, so we're in this cycle now where we elect somebody from one party who promises to fix things on the federal level. I said federal level, president, change we can believe in, drain the swamp, all that kind of stuff. And then nothing ever happened. So we're in this sort of cycle of politics where it's like, first you fail, then I fail. And the parties take turns at failing, and nobody ever fixes the problem. I mean, running schools in this country is not like quantum physics, right? I mean, look at a successful school. I'm sure there's successful schools all over Arizona. What's involved? You have a good principal. You have teachers that work hard. You have an engaged parent body. It's you have people who are trying hard and who care about the children and the students. So why is it that we can't fix our schools? It's not because everybody's a jerk who gets elected. It's because you're not allowed to. leadership has been preempted by bureaucracy, which has been imposed in large part by collective bargaining agreements.
A real good example of that out here and elsewhere throughout the country, of course, are charter schools. Arizona specifically has literally the five highest performing public schools in the country that are charter schools. And of course, the difference is that charter schools are not bound by collective bargaining agreements. They have their own charters, separate, independent with the state. So they avoid all of the issues you're talking about, Philip, with the bureaucratic problems and inertia and some of these protections that don't exist anywhere else. And I think education is one of these areas where you see the most unseemly problem of these dual fiduciary duties, where the unions, that national, state, local, their objective is not to educate children. Their objective is to educate the membership, which is why they oppose, or I'm sorry, to get benefits and protect the membership and educate them, oftentimes with their own ideologies, which is why they oppose things that oftentimes would create more educational opportunities for children, educational savings accounts, vouchers, charter schools, that sort of thing. Do you want to speak to some of that dual fiduciary issue?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they're not representing the best interests of students. I mean, look at what happened with COVID. The teachers' unions wouldn't let the teachers go back to work. Well, the charter schools and the parochial schools and the private schools all went back to had school again and worked out fine. But the public schools couldn't. So who are they protecting? Are they really interested in the students or are they interested in the teachers? They're interested in the teachers. So, time after, the stories are just going forever. I remember one new teacher telling me, I came down the first week of school, we have the indoctrination section where people talk about how the schools run, public school in New York. And 45 minutes into the program, the principal and assistant principal are talking about their plans and their dreams for a successful year. And half the teachers get up and leave the room right in the middle of the sentence. And that's because the union contract said that you're only required to be in sessions with the principal, with the administration of school for 45 minutes. It's a, I have another acquaintance who worked at the Department of Defense in emergency aid, and during a crisis in the Balkans that happened late one day, and it was really a humanitarian crisis. People were being murdered and stuff. It had just come in. They were working it, and half an hour later, half the people in the apartment leave. It's 5 o'clock. Or the. Yeah, I mean, again, these stories go on and on. It's intolerable. I mean, you just can't run a family. You can't run you just can't run an organization that way.
Again, if anybody has questions, please go and tap them into the Q&A box, and we'll take them as they come in. I view a lot of the problem, Philip, as a challenge to convince the public about all of these pernicious problems that flow from powerful government unions. And because I think when you just talk to just your normal guy or gal on the street and you say, look, I mean, how do you feel about unions? I think you rightfully have a response that, well, people have a right to organize, people have a right to a spokesperson, and they just don't quite see the second, third, and fourth order effects that powerful labor unions create. How do you address the challenge of speaking to the public about these sorts of issues?
Yeah, really important. It's just a matter of due process.
Right.
It's just a matter of due process that 98% of all teachers in Florida are deemed effective.
Right.
In California,
Right.
and yet they have lousy schools, at least in California. I was talking to a former governor last week about all this, and he said, in order to start a movement, you really need to have very pointed platform, and you also need to have villains. there are in fact people who are keeping things from happening. And uh, so I think the fact that we elect people, but they don't have the authority to run the police department or the schools is a pretty powerful argument. Let them talk about due process, but that isn't how it works. Nobody's accountable. So, I think the, the advantage of bringing this constitutional challenge is it takes it from being a complaint about the unions, which people have heard about forever, to being an action item. This is so bad that we believe it violates the United States Constitution because our democracy no longer can work. Democracy is nothing but a process of accountability. If you take away the, links in the chain to accountability, democracy cannot work. It's really just that simple.
So on the constitutional questions, I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with the Janus decision, where the U.S. Supreme Court struck down what are called agency fees, where prior to this decision in non-right to work states, the government could compel government employees to pay union dues, even if the employee didn't want to belong to the labor union. And in Janus v. Afshmi, the Supreme Court said that that was impermissible under the free expression and association provisions of the U.S. Constitution. If, and maybe I'm hearing you wrong, but if the objective is to eliminate collective bargaining as a component of this, is that another path separate and apart from an Article 4 Republican form of government claim?
Well, I just think the only way you're going to get rid of collective bargaining, that's the mechanism by which accountability disappears, are these collective bargaining agreements. So people are going to have a union and they can go and sit and talk about whatever they want to talk about, organizing the summer picnic. There are all kinds of things that unions could do that would probably be useful that don't involve putting shackles on political leaders. But collective bargaining puts shackles on the political leaders so that democracy can't work anymore. And so the constitutional claim is not against unions per se, it's against the collective bargaining agreements that disempower the political leaders. So that is the basis for the claim. I mean, without any question in my mind, the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, the federal law, which imposed collective bargaining, is clearly unconstitutional. So I just got an email actually from somebody with whom I've been working on this, who's just been nominated for a big job in the current administration. He said, okay, we're going to take this stuff on. So we'll see. But I think if we bring a constitutional claim and we prepare a dossier with lots of stories, like some of the ones you've told and I've told, of abuses of this, which are just rampant. Bad teachers who can't do their job. You can't get rid of the VA supervisor who did a lousy job. People will get interested because there's the possibility of action. And then there'll be a court decision, and the initial court decision will say, no, there's no basis for this lawsuit. And they'll dismiss it because the court doesn't think it has the authority to do this, probably. So we'll have to have the decision by the Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court, I think, will be receptive to these arguments because it's a real problem. It's not a made-up problem. It's not a partisan problem. I mean, if in a back room, most Democratic governors would agree with me. But they can't say anything about it because their money's coming from the public unions.
Right. So Rebecca's got a really good question here. Do you equate the power of public unions to corporate lobbying groups that represent private industry? I covered, I think, two issues there, and I'd be interested in hearing Philip's response to this too. The first, in my view, is the relationship between public labor unions that have collective bargaining rights and any other special interest. Public labor unions have unique specific access to government and government policymaking that no other group does anywhere in our system of government. And they're able to enter into agreements that have the force and effect of law sitting across the table of the very people that they elect. So the relationship and the access that collective bargaining gives to labor unions has no analogy in the private sector. And I would also say, secondly, in the private sector, as Philip mentioned, both sides have an incentive to make it work, right? The public or the private union wants to keep jobs. They want to keep employment. They don't want the company to go bankrupt. The company wants the company to stay viable, wants happy employees. Both sides have an incentive to make it work. In the public sector, both sides are playing with house money. So that incentive simply doesn't exist. And in fact, the incentives are quite perverse, where you have, essentially the union negotiating with itself when it elects the person on the other side of the table that it's negotiating with. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Philip.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. And the power is in part the fact that the government can't work without these very people. So it's not like it's the General Motors lobbyist coming in and saying we need something better, and it's as if General Motors was in charge of all the all the typewriters and was writing all the bills and all that kind of stuff and coming in. I mean, it's different in kind. I mean, the lobbyists in Washington, the lobbyists in state capitals, are effective at preserving the status quo generally. They're not effective generally at getting things for themselves. Every once in a while they get in a crisis, they'll get some tax benefit or something will slip in, but by and large not. And most lobbying is about keeping the farm subsidy. You could never get away with a new farm subsidy in 2021. It's been 80 years or 85 years since any farmer was in danger of starving, which is when the farm subsidies were put in the New Deal. But it's almost impossible to get rid of them unless you have a kind of a spring cleaning. So one of the things that I have a essay in this just came out yesterday or whatever, in the Ripon Forum on what the Republican platform should be for making government work effectively. And I've just said three things, but the first one is appoint nonpartisan spring cleaning commissions. Just go and clean it out. It's been literally since the 1960s, since anybody actually went into the rule books and said, does this stuff work? And the answer is, of course, none of it works because nobody's gone back in to fix it any more than your house would work if you used all the appliances you had then and never fixed them. I mean, that's what the laws of the United States. It's like sediment in the harbor. It's prison. The second one is the one we're talking about, which is to have a constitutional challenge to collective bargaining agreements. And my third platform item is we have to put principal limits on lawsuits. If you let anybody claim that they have a right not to be disappointed in the workplace or anyplace else, it's like giving power to the lowest common denominator. You can't run anything. We all feel you can't be honest in the workplace. We all face it. So those are really simple items I think the Republicans could all readily stand for. But I think the thing that will get attention is this constitutional challenge, because it doesn't require organizing, 80 million voters. It requires organizing the case. And the case is compelling.
Well, we got time for a couple more questions, and we have some in the chat box. Bill asked, how many students leaving would it take before there was no public school system in a district? In other words, maybe the problem is the public. So I think speaking to perhaps questions of competition in education, and if parents did have meaningful choices to take their students either to another district and maybe their dollars would follow them, or to a private school or a charter school or a home school or some other system that worked for parents, maybe that would create a sort of incentive that that could help bring public education up through just the natural forces of competition, which is why, in my view, school choice is so important. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Philip.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with that, but that's a political issue, and the politics has been paralyzed by the power of these unions. So you want to do that? Great. Let's have a constitutional challenge to the public unions, and then all of a sudden, you can have lots more charter schools and lots more school choice and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Okay, and David, and this is probably going to be our last question here. David asks, is there a meaningful difference when a private nonprofit professional organization includes annual membership fees and labels a fee for things like advocacy or lobbying, as opposed to a PAC fee, so a fee for a political action committee? And he goes on to say he believes the U.S. Supreme Court has previously decided that PAC fees are not constitutional and cannot be mandatory.
Sure, there's the difference. You can drop out of the not-for-profit organization. If you're a teacher and your dues are forced to go to for political action that you disagree with, you don't have you can't keep your job, without doing it. So a nonprofit that you disagree with, you just drop out. Easy.
Right. It's always the compulsion, and in my view, when you're dealing with private labor organizations versus public labor organizations, or private advocacy groups versus public labor unions, which function as advocacy groups, it's always the compulsion of other employees within the labor group, the compulsion of the taxpayer. That's always frankly, the moral difference, but also the constitutional and legal difference between the two.
Agreed.
Well, we are right at about the 2 o'clock hour. I want to say thanks again, Philip, for joining us. That was really interesting stuff. I'd like to chat with you more about some of the legal issues and claims.
I'd love to work with the Goldwater Institute on this. I mean, this has to be a national. This is this is really a national drive. And the more people we get involved, the greater the chances of success.
Yep, 100%. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us. You can find more of Philip's work at the Common Good website. What is that, commongood.org, Philip?
Yeah, commongood.org.
And of course, you can follow our work at goldwaterinstitute.org. If you have any follow-up questions after today's program, please send us questions and we'll be happy to take them up. Thank you again, Philip, for all the great work you do, and hopefully we'll have a chance to speak again and work together.
Great, excellent. It's great to be with you.
Thank you all. Have a good day.